Literary elements are the technical components in all narrative stories. They are the essential elements that make a story engaging, compelling, and universally appealing. When you have an understanding of the basic literary elements in story structure, you become a better reader and a better writer. In today's lesson, we will take a look at the basic elements or components of narrative literature: characters, setting, plot, theme, and point of view. Let's begin.
Let's start with characters. A character can be a person, an animal, a being, a creature, even a thing. We can divide characters into two major categories: the main characters, minor characters. The two main characters are the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is the main character around which the whole story revolves, and the antagonist could be a character or a group of characters that causes conflict for the protagonist. There are also minor characters. These interact with the main character and help move the story along, but they have less influence on the story. Now, you heard me say that the antagonist causes conflict for the protagonist. What do we mean by conflict? In the literary sense, conflict does not necessarily mean a quarrel or an argument, but it does mean an opposition, a force that pushes back on the character. This type of conflict thwarts the character's desire to achieve his or her goal, because without conflict, there would be no story. Conflict is what moves the story along. You will encounter 6 types of conflict. You will find character versus self. This is called man versus self. This type of conflict is inside the character's mind. It usually involves an inner struggle with self-doubt, a moral dilemma, or the character's own nature. Character versus character. This is also known as man versus man. This involves 2 characters struggling against each other. The conflict may manifest in different ways, from physical altercations to irreconcilable differences in morals or beliefs. Character versus nature. A character versus nature occurs when a character faces resistance from a natural force. This can be the weather, the wilderness, or a natural disaster. And as you'll see, the setting of the story is tied into this type of conflict. Character versus supernatural. A character versus a supernatural conflict occurs when a character faces resistance from a supernatural force, such as fate, magical forces, otherworldly beings, aliens, religion, and gods. Character versus technology. Character versus technology conflict is at the center of science fiction. This type of conflict explores the problems that arise when technology goes beyond its intended use. Character versus society. This type of conflict occurs when a character goes against the laws of society, culture, a tyrannical government, or an unfair community. Usually the protagonist is a selfless individual who fights against injustice and wants to correct it. The setting. The setting of a story is important because it provides the reader with a context of the time, place, and environment that the story takes place in. The setting is the time and place where a scene occurs. The setting helps set the mood, influence the way characters behave, affect the dialogue, foreshadow events, evoke an emotional response, reflect the society in which the characters live in, and contribute to the tone of the story, which some consider to be a separate element. Plot. Let's talk about the time elements of the plot, the 7 basic narrative frameworks, and plot structure. In traditional plot structure, you have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution or conclusion. In an exposition, the author gives you the background information to establish the setting and describe the situation. The plot moves along to the rising action. The characters face or try to solve problems. This goes back to the conflict that the characters experience within themselves or others. Eventually, the story reaches the peak critical moment, and that's why this part is called the climax. The story then goes into the falling action. This is called the denouement. This is the part of the story that explores the consequences of the climax, and here the tension, conflict, or problems begin to resolve. And finally, we have the resolution or conclusion, and this is where the story's central problem is finally solved, and the reader is left with a sense of completion. Plot structure. When an author decides to write a story, she could use 4 plot structures: the linear plot, the episodic, the parallel, or the flashback. The linear plot is probably the most common structure. It occurs in a chronological timeline. The linear plot starts at a certain event and progresses to the climax and then to the resolution. It follows the most common plot structure. The episodic plot, however, weaves a unifying theme throughout a series of episodes and self-contained subplots. This plot structure also uses chronological order, but its main features is the use of various characters to weave a common theme or narrative. It is most commonly used in novels, where characters and their unique viewpoints are presented in each chapter. The parallel plot is a structure that enables the author to combine multiple plots in a story. These plots will meet at the climax of the story through events and characters that are linked through a common theme. Because this plot shows multiple rising actions meeting at one climax, it creates an emotional or moving narrative. The flashback. In the flashback plot structure, there are events that take place before the main story begins. The flashback interrupts the chronological order of the main narrative, and it takes the reader back to a time to past events in the character's life. This backstory helps the reader get a full understanding of the present events before going to the upcoming events. Now let's go on to the 7 basic narrative frameworks or archetypes: overcoming the monster, rags to riches, quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. In the overcoming the monster archetype, the main character or protagonist sets out to defeat an antagonistic force, often an evil force that threatens the protagonist. This evil is something larger or greater than the protagonist, and it will take great courage and strength to defeat this evil foe. In a rags to riches story, a poor character gains something they lack, either money, power, or love. Then they'll lose it again, but will win it back by the end of the story, after becoming a better person or overcoming a situation. The quest archetype. In a quest story, the main character must reach a certain location to obtain an object or fulfill a certain objective, while conquering many obstacles along the way. The quest story also has certain elements. You have the quester, who is the character who goes on a journey, a place to go, a reason to go, and challenges along the way. And at the end, the real mission is revealed, which is usually self-knowledge, learning a lesson, having discovered something about themselves that they didn't know before. The voyage and return archetype is very similar to the quest, and it's very common in children's literature because it usually involves a voyage to a magical land. The magical land is happy and light at first, but then it turns dark. The character must conquer an obstacle or force, and once it's vanquished, the character makes his return back home. And like the quest story, the hero in the voyage and return has learned a valuable lesson, or discovered something about themselves that they didn't know before. Comedy. The plot structure is light and humorous and has a happy ending. The conflict is usually based on confusion and chaos, but everything comes together in the end, and most romance films and novels fall into this archetype. Tragedy. In a tragedy, the protagonist has a major character flaw, or makes an irredeemable mistake which is ultimately his or her undoing. The tragic hero in literature evokes a feeling of fear or pity as the reader witnesses the character's ultimate demise. The character's folly leads them into further darkness and eventually to death and destruction. And the final plot archetype is the rebirth. The rebirth archetype is basically a redemption story. The rebirth archetype has its roots in religion, but in literature, however, it involves a character changing her ways and becoming a better person, resulting in a happy ending. And rebirth can mean a number of things: reinvention, a change of heart, a literal death, and rising again. Because whether it's literal or metaphorical, rebirth signifies great change and development for the character. Let's go on to theme. Theme is the underlying meaning that the writer explores in a novel, a short story, or any other literary work. All the previous elements mentioned work together to create the theme of the story. There are 6 basic themes in literature: good versus evil, love, redemption, perseverance, coming of age, and revenge. Good versus evil is the most universal theme. The struggle between good and bad, light and dark, life and death. The main character will face obstacles, but in the end, it will triumph over evil. Love. Love can be found either as a main theme or as a minor theme in most literary works. Love can be a guiding force for inspiration and sacrifice, or for madness and violence. And in the end, many literary works will conclude that love conquers all. Redemption. In the theme of redemption, the character sees the error of his ways and strives to right the wrongs they've committed. Stories of redemption often involve characters who reform themselves by sacrificing their freedom or their life for others. Courage and perseverance. Characters in stories about courage and perseverance endure difficult circumstances or impossible odds. They persevere through sheer determination, grit, and moxie. Coming of age. The coming of age story follows one or more characters during their journey of growing up into adulthood. These characters may experience anything from a loss of innocence to an awakening. There is a self-awareness before they finally reach maturity. Revenge. The theme of revenge sets up a conflict between one of the characters and his enemies as he journeys to avenge the wrongs done to him. The theme of revenge also explores the human costs and moral dilemmas associated with pursuing vengeance in the first place. Let's go on to point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which the story is told. The author chooses who is telling the story by the point of view. Depending on who the narrator is, he or she will be standing at one point and seeing the action. There is first-person point of view, second-person point of view, and third-person point of view. Let's start with first person. In the first-person point of view, the narrator uses the pronoun I in order to give the reader an intimate view of the characters. The second-person point of view is rarely used in fiction. It uses the pronoun you to address the reader. This narrative implies that the reader is either the protagonist or a character in the story, and the events are happening to them. The author uses the second-person point of view when he wants to make the audience feel as if they are part of the story or action. And the third-person point of view is probably the most common in literary text. The narrator exists outside the events of the story and relates the actions of the characters by referring to their names or by third-person pronouns: he, she, they. Third-person point of view can be categorized into 3 parts, or 3 different styles: third-person omniscient, limited omniscient, or objective. In the third-person omniscient point of view, the omniscient narrator knows everything about the story and its characters. The narrator enters any character's mind and moves freely through time. The narrator gives the reader her own opinions and observations as well as those of the characters. An omniscient narrator knows every character's thoughts, feelings, and motivation, even if that character doesn't reveal any of it to the other characters. The narrator knows. In limited omniscient point of view, the author sticks to one character, but still remains in third person. The narrator can do this for the entire novel or switch between different characters or different chapters or sections. The limited omniscient point of view allows the author to limit a reader's perspective and control what information the reader knows. The thing to remember about limited omniscient is that the narrator does not know the motivation or thoughts of every single character. And the last point of view is the third person objective. The narrator has a neutral stance. He does not know the character's thoughts or feelings. He simply is presenting the story with an observational tone. The third person objective point of view puts the reader in the position of a voyeur, sort of eavesdropping on a scene or the story. Because the narrator reports the events that are taking place without knowing the motivation or thoughts of any of the characters, the reader knows little about them or what drives them.
When you are familiar with the basic elements of a story, you're better able to interpret and respond to text. Having an awareness of these concepts supports the understanding of the author's message, purpose, and context. So make sure you go back and review the sections that you did not understand. And before you go, please take a moment to subscribe and to hit that notification bell so that you will be notified every time I upload a new video. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye!